Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel. And today we're going to be going over some more advanced tips and tricks for the Game of War Thunder and specifically the Ground RB mode. Last time we went over some beginner tips. These are just things to help you understand what's going on from moment to moment in the game. So a lot of what we're going to be doing this time is going to be more like big picture and macro stuff to help you improve your win rate by making better overall decisions. The first few tips are macro stuff that you can do in the hangar just to make sure that you're optimizing your efficiency from that end. Now, when you go into the hangar, you'll notice this little button on the bottom of the screen, these little arrows going up and down. If you click this, you will get a UI. The UI will let you create basically as many lineups as you want and also rename them to different things. Personally, I rename them for the battle rating, but it's whatever. You can resort them, rearrange them, rename them to your heart's content. Now, if you're a new player getting started out, you don't necessarily have full lineups and you aren't necessarily like at a position where you can rearrange stuff that readily. So it's not that big of a deal, but once you start getting to like the mid or higher battle ratings, it's very useful to have these ready to go. That way you can go down to lower battle ratings if you ever need or just want to play specific lineups. You don't necessarily have to do every lineup a nation can play. You can limit it to just the stuff you enjoy playing, but it is very handy. On top of that, one thing that you will want to do whenever you start a new nation for the first time is you will just want to go through and spend the silver to go up to 5 crew slots for that nation. There are several reasons for this, but the biggest one is because this kind of sets you up for success. Now, if we go through my sample lineups, you'll notice all of my sample lineups have the same type of vehicle in the same slot. For example, all of the anti-airs are in the same slot, all of the light tanks are in the same slot, all of the tank destroyers, all of the aircraft are in the same slots. This is very beneficial for several reasons. The first reason is that it makes it very fluid to add or remove vehicles, especially if the battle ratings change. Like if all of a sudden you can't use a light tank with a specific lineup anymore, you can just drop down to the next light tank. It's in the same slot, there's no problem. Same with anti-air, same with tank destroyers. Additionally, this also gets you in the mindset when you're developing lineups of thinking, how do I fill these slots? Like, what is the most efficient way to play this lineup? And it gets you looking for those things to have a good lineup. Now, the decision to go up to 6 or 7 garage slots is really going to be very player dependent. For me personally, that decision usually comes down to how good are the cast options at different battle ratings. USA, for example, I run a full 7 because it turns out USA has a ton of good planes and helicopters that you can run at basically any battle rating. So USA doesn't have a problem filling out 7 slots, but for some of the minor nations, it can be kind of dodgy to go all the way up to 7 or even 6 in some cases. For Israel, you could do perfectly fine with say 5 slots, although I do personally run 7 for them. Another interesting thing to note, and one thing that you want to keep in mind, is that aircraft and ground vehicles use different crew XP, so that's part of the reason why you want to segregate your air and your ground vehicles, so that you're not kind of overlapping or wasting your time giving them XP for vehicles you're not using all the time. So it lets you focus on the types of vehicles that crew will generally be used for, rather than just splitting it up a bunch. When building a lineup, it's also kind of important to ask yourself like what types of vehicles you need. Ideally, you want something that works really well in an up tier and things that work really well in down tiers. You want vehicles that work well on small maps and big maps. And you also need to remember that the more times you spawn a vehicle of a specific type, the more the spawn penalty of vehicles of that type increases. For example, this is the reason why you don't see a lot of players using multiple fighters in the same lineup. You generally want a fighter and an attacker, or a fighter and a bomber, or a fighter and a helicopter, or something like that. Because trying to spawn the second fighter, you'll get a massive increase to its spawn costs to the point where it's kind of not really worth it. Whereas if you have a fighter and a ground attacker, they will have basically the same spawn cost, plus or minus ordnance and modifiers for being up or down tiers. So just little things to keep in mind when you're building lineups that you want to keep in the back of your head. The next big tip is going to be when you load into a map trying to figure out if it's an up tier or if it's a down tier. Easiest way to tell is look at your medium tanks and light tanks. Your medium tanks and light tanks both have the same base spawn cost, and if it is a max up tier, they will cost 100 spawn points. If it's a max down tier, they will cost 150 spawn points. Heavy tanks tend to be higher in spawn cost, tank destroyers and anti-air tend to be lower in spawn cost. Just keep that in the back of your mind, but it's an easy way to know if it's an up tier or a down tier. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize, is that in a game of War Thunder, only a third of all players in a given match can have the top tier. So if you're an 8.0 to 9.0 match, only a third of the players on either team can have 9.0 vehicles in their lineup. So this is something to keep in mind, and it's part of the reason why max up tiers, while they can be kind of frustrating, usually aren't that bad in terms of kneecapping your ability to have good performances. Now, War Thunder has 3 different game modes you can effectively get dropped into. You can either get a 1 cap, a 2 cap, or a 3 cap. The 2 cap actually works completely differently than the 1 or the 3 cap, and I do see this throwing people off a bit. In the 1 or 3 cap, you capture the points, and whichever team has more points, they deplete tickets from the enemy team. And the amount you deplete is based on the number of points you have over them. So if you have a full 3 cap, the points are going to bleed faster than if it's like a 2 to a 1. In the 2 cap scenario, however, once you capture the zone, you basically just win. Like, the ticket bleed is so insanely fast, no matter when in the maps you capture it, that once a team captures it, there's almost no opportunity to go in and recap it or do anything like that to try and prevent that team from winning. Now, in the 1 or 3 cap scenarios, while the ticket bleed is basically always active, it's important to remember that once you get to the midpoint and the late point, the actual ticket bleed for controlling the points starts to speed up. So it's not that essential that you grab a zone right away within like the first 5 minutes, although it can put you in a better position in late game. But it is very, very important once you start getting past the 10-minute mark that you make sure you control at least as many zones as your opponent, ideally more, because the ticket bleed starts getting really bad during the end of the game, to the point where you can end up losing it very quickly before you ever get a chance to get back on the zone and decap that. And it's also important to note, if the game starts getting to the wire, that another way that tickets can deplete other than zone caps is actually getting kills. Each kill is worth 100 tickets. So if your team only has 500 tickets left, the enemy doesn't need zones. They can just get 5 kills and easily come away with a W. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind when you're looking at the scorecard is, yes, the zone caps matter, but you also need to be looking at the exact number of tickets people have when it starts getting really close to the end of the game. The game you see in the background actually ended up being insanely close. We had around 48 tickets left. 1 kill would have immediately ended the match, and I started getting really annoyed with my team when in that position the fighters start going near the enemy anti-air. All the enemy has to do is pop 1 fighter and they instantly win the match, even though we control the only zone. This is something that you kind of need to get used to looking at in terms of the scoreboard, and this is one of the things I'm looking at when I look at the scoreboard is how many tickets do we have left? How many deaths can we afford to have before we just straight up lose? Because even if you're in a dominant position with all 3 zones, if you only have like 40 tickets left and you lose 1 person, you lose anyway. So keep that in the back of your mind. This also leads to another meaningful topic that is not discussed enough in War Thunder, but it is very common in esports in general, and this is the concept of playing your life. That is, understanding when you simply existing is enough to win the game for the team, your team, or at least tie down the enemy team enough that it's a serious problem for them. In the next game in the background, we end with about 400 tickets left, but more importantly, if we ever lose this 1 zone cap, we basically instantly lose. So you'll see me in the background, I'm just popping smoke relentlessly. I don't have to win any gunfight with any enemy, because this is another point that is important to note that most players don't seem to realize. As long as you are on a zone, the status of that zone cannot change. So if the zone is neutral and both players have a player on it, it's not going anywhere. If it's friendly to you and you are on it, the enemy can't decap it. If it's friendly to the enemy and they are on it, you can't decap it. So always keep that in mind, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is just be on a zone and not get killed. I've seen a lot of teams lose games because players left a zone for no reason. Just as long as you have any part of your vehicle on that zone, you will prevent the cap and you will buy time for your team. There are going to be moments when you play War Thunder where the most important thing you can do for your team is not die, because as soon as you die, that entire area of control is gone and the enemy team can just push in. They can take it freely, they can take zones, they can take board position, and they can threaten your team. So one thing that War Thunder players are just really bad about is playing their lives, and this is one of those lessons that once you learn it, you will instantly become a better player. Going into topics of things that will make you a better player, it's important to understand that when capturing a zone, The amount of spawn points and credit you get for capturing that zone is based on the percentage you are on the zone. So if you are on that zone for 100% of the capture, it doesn't matter if it's just you or if it's you and 6 other people, you will get 100% of the reward for that capture, including spawn points, score, all that good stuff. This is very important because a lot of people don't seem to realize this, because they'll just run to a zone that is very close to their team, capture it out from under their entire team, and what this effectively does is it denies your team spawn points. It makes your teammates less effective. There is no benefit to you whatsoever to doing this. It is purely a detriment. The only technical benefit if you're in a really fast vehicle is time, but if you're in a really fast vehicle, you shouldn't be stealing your own objectives from your own team. You should be going to get into really good positions to annoy the enemy team. That should be a higher priority because that'll be a lot more useful, and you're not going to be actively kneecapping your own team by doing that. Another mistake that a lot of players make is uncapping zones. So in order to uncap a zone, to remove the enemy's control over it, all you have to do is touch the zone and then you can leave. The zone will automatically uncap itself and become neutral, assuming nobody else touches it. And then once it's done that, then you can start recapping it. The significant thing to note here is that you don't get anything for uncapping that zone. All you do is remove the enemy's control over it, so it might stop ticket bleed, but that's about all it does. If the enemy were just to move in and recapture that zone, now all you've done by uncapping it is given them more spawn points to work with. You've given them more ability to spawn vehicles to defeat you. So going around and uncapping zones, unless it's really late in the game and you just desperately need to stop ticket bleeds, is usually not a good idea. This is also the reason why most good players don't even bother going for the zones in the 2-cap maps at all until the game is basically over. Because it turns out if you go straight for the zone in the 2-cap map and you start uncapping it, it takes about a minute to uncap it and a minute to cap it, and that is a long time, especially given that most of them are right next to the enemy spawn. So unless you've really thinned down the enemy team, the likelihood of you completing a capture is basically zero, and you're just giving the enemy team more spawn points. And the 2-cap maps are often just wars of attrition. You're just trading, like, essentially kills for most of their duration. So giving the enemy spawn points on those maps is kind of fatal in a lot of situations. And this is one thing you players really need to understand and internalize, is that the 2-cap map, you should only ever go for the cap if you are almost guaranteed to get it, and if the enemy team is completely depleted. They only have a handful of people left and you significantly outnumber them. To go through with a final basic tip, you usually want to limit the number of players in one single area, 2, maybe 3 people on a stretch. The reason you want to do this is because if you put your entire team in one area, you've just given the enemy the entire map. Now your team is fighting basically a 360. They're fighting in all directions. Additionally, you're very easy to focus fire with things down like CAS, all that stuff. You only really need 1 or 2 teammates to successfully push a lane or a zone, and a lot of times you can even do that on your own. If you notice your team is just clustering up in 1 or 2 areas, and you see the opportunity to go for flanks where there might be gaps in the enemy's defenses, you should definitely just push it on your own and see what happens. It's one of those, to a certain extent in War Thunder, the game favors you playing with confidence and playing as though you can win a one-on-one fight. And if you're not doing that, you're going to end up playing very passively, and this is kind of a self-dooming prophecy as opposed to a self-fulfilling one. If you play very passively and defensively, you're giving the opponent a lot of opportunities to try and find ways to dig you out of a position, and especially if you're staying in one place for a very long period of time, you increase the likelihood you're going to get hit by aircraft, you increase the likelihood you're going to get hit by artillery. So you kind of want to always look for the opportunity to upgrade your position or to find gaps in the enemy's defenses. This isn't to say you should always be mindlessly pushing, but you need to be confident enough in your abilities and your vehicles, and if you are confident, you actually start experiencing better results even if you're not the greatest player, because it turns out like just being aggressive and just playing as though you can win will result in more victories. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like or subscribe. This is still a smaller channel and that stuff is always appreciated. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had fun. Have a nice day, everybody.